Thanks very much, Yvonne. Yes, I do remember those days in Greater Manchester, and it's moved on a lot as well. And yes, thank you. And Jamie, I just have to say that moving healthcare professionals has really moved on. When I did a bit of work for London 2012, and it was to go to 2 practices in every borough in London to train GPs about physical activity. So it was the really first time it was being done. And I used to ask them, what are the guidelines on physical activity? And as I went through, I still did not get the first doctor who knew what they were. And when I got to halfway, I thought, this is really strange. Not a single doctor in London knows the guidance. And then actually, as I got towards the end, I didn't want any doctor to know about the guidance, because the story of 0 doctors knowing about physical activity guidance was so much better than 1 doctor knowing. So I used to kind of mumble, do you know the guidance? Oh, never mind, okay. We just sort of moved on. So it was 0 in the end. And now it's 36%, I think it was up there, which is a massive shift when you think how many doctors there are. So that's been really exciting. So let me just tell you a story to kind of frame the talk. So when I first started the health walks back in the 90s, I remember there was a lady who was taking part, and I got the story about her, and we'll call her Joan, and she sadly lost her husband about 3 or 4 years beforehand. She was in her early 60s, and she'd stayed pretty much at home all that time since he died, and she got more depressed and more isolated, and her friends were trying to get her out. They were trying to get her to move on and sort of start to say, look, you come out and friend, but she couldn't do it. And after a few years of persuading, one of her friends said, why don't you come along to the health walks? And she thought, well, there's no way I can go on a walk with lots of people. I haven't done any activity. I'm frightened of being outdoors. I didn't want to be with all strangers who I didn't know. But eventually, the friend persuaded her to come out. And she sat there, and initially she used to just turn up and then go back again, didn't take part in the walk. And then she started making the tea, because there was always some tea in an urn, which was done right at the beginning of one of the walks in a lovely woodland area. And that was her job. She made the tea. She didn't go on a walk. And for 6 months, she made the tea. And then finally, she found the courage to go on 1 walk. And then she did another. It was only 1/4 of a mile, and then it was 1/2 a mile. And then she started to get into the regular walking. And she started to kind of turn up, and she looked forward to it. And she then became a health walk leader. And then she was one of the kind of stalwarts who carried on the whole program of health walks. It took about 3 years for her to go through from that first attempt to turn up to then. Her depression lifted, her medication disappeared, her hypertension went. She was completely transformed. Now the question is, what sorted out her depression? Was it her friend? Was it turning up to something on a regular basis and feeling useful? Was it the environment, because it was a beautiful area? Was it the social, or was it the physical activity? Well, it was a mixture. But the physical activity was in the context of a much bigger set of parameters. It wasn't your 150 minutes. Because 150 minutes for her on a treadmill in a whitewashed room would not have been the same. And this is what I want to talk about now, is how we look at physical activity in the context of mental health. So starting, it's very simple. Our factory settings are that we have to be with other people, we have to be in a supportive place, feeling safe, and we've got to have some purpose in life. That is pretty much right through, like a stick of rock, through every single human being. When we get that, then things all build well for resilience. And the resilience, all it means is that if you get a knock, if you get a stress, you get acute stress response, and then you recover. And it's that recovery that's what is resilience. And that leads to positive emotions. We're designed absolutely fine, we're on an even keel, everything is good, and that makes it much easier to have a healthy lifestyle, because this is exactly how we were designed. So what happens when things go wrong? Well, if you get the loneliness and you're feeling unsafe, which is one of the key things, not just for humans, for any animal, and you have no purpose, then you're going to have poor resilience. And we know loneliness is really bad. It's about the same risk factor that smoking is to heart disease. So it's a pretty nasty thing to have, and it's a perception. It's not, you can have isolation, and people love being isolated, but loneliness is when you feel outside. You can be lonely in a crowd, you can be lonely in a family, you can be lonely in a workplace, you can be lonely in a school, when you don't feel you belong. And when you get that, then you get stressful events like before. You get acute stress response, which is completely normal as you had before, but now you don't recover. You get chronic stress, and chronic stress is completely different. You are now a new animal. You're an animal in defense. You're an animal that's set up to be trying to protect yourself. And all those negative emotions are very much designed initially to try and help you. Fear and anxiety is so you don't make the same mistakes again. Sadness and depression are initially to withdraw you. So the fight and flight is what really is kind of developing all those. Unfortunately, of course, in this day and age, they're all negative, and they start to impact on us, and they're not for survival anymore. So we get stress hormones, the cortisol, pouring out all the time, and that leads to all of these poor sleep, inactivity, poor diet, addictions. So these are all protection. Why do you want to burn up calories when you don't need them? So you become less active. Why not eat as many calories so you get ghrelin and you get less leptin and all these other hormones to make you eat and eat and eat and eat? Because the body is now in defense. It's trying to get as many calories in as possible. So you can see how this cascades is, and in the inequalities, of course, where at the top you not only get the loneliness, unsafe and no purpose, but you also get more stressful events, which leads to all of this. But there's feedback. Inactivity also means you lose purpose in life. You become lonely because you're not mixing with people and you don't interact with the natural environment. In fact, less people outside, you're going to get problems there. And a study came out showing that really is a cycle here, that you get increased stress that leads to physical inactivity, that reduces the resilience, which then leads to more stress, which more inactivity, and you get this cycle that goes through. And it's almost impossible, because what we've been trying to do is to change the physical activity on its own. But if you've got stress pouring down onto it, your body is going to say, oh, I don't want to burn up calories, I don't need to, I've got no motivation. So you have to make a break. And you do that by making people feel they belong, they feel safe, and they have purpose. And that purpose also leads to self-esteem, competence. So whatever you're doing, whether it's a leisure group or an activity group or any way you're trying to get people more active, we've got to make sure they feel they belong. They've got to feel safe. They've got to have that purpose. Their self-esteem has got to be improved. They've got to have that competence and that positive body image. That can break that cycle. And then they become active, and that then hopefully makes it much more of a positive experience. Teenagers are stressed, and their brains are focused on basic survival very often. In fact, when we're stressed, motivation is really hard. But the body is really telling you, don't waste calories. We have really, really basic things going on in our brain telling us not to become active. So we can't blame people when they're inactive, because most of the time it's not them being lazy, it's just that they're in a stressful situation. So we go all the way down there, and then finally we get to some of these things, which are the visceral fat, chronic inflammation, short telomeres, free radicals, all the things that Yvonne remembers when I was talking about, and I'm going to touch on them a bit later on. But they cause some of the more fundamental problems that we get: depression, anxiety, dementia, and fatigue. So you can see that anxiety is kind of sitting both sides, but these are the physical aspects of being inactive cause that. So it's the top bit we've got to really work on. So I'm going to do the science bit now. So first of all, inflammation. If you get inflammation, it's when your immune system is turning against us. Chronic inflammation is the cause of pretty much most long-term conditions, certainly for heart disease, dementia, arthritis, diabetes, obesity can cause it. Chronic inflammation is the disease, really, that we're trying to deal with, because its consequence is pretty bad. In the brain, it has a very strange effect. Those little orange blobs are the amygdala. They're the fear blobs. They're very primitive, reptilian brain. every animal's pretty much got them. Let's say you're in a street, you're walking down there and a black bin bag suddenly flies up in the wind in the dusk and you immediately startle. You're really fear, a cold sweat goes down you. That's your amygdala cutting in immediately. Your frontal cortex says, it's a bin bag, don't be so stupid, go back to normal, okay? You relax, you can see it. Now what would happen if that frontal cortex didn't speak to the amygdala? What happens if those two parts didn't connect? Well, the amygdala will carry on telling you that there's fear around. And that's what happens when you get chronic inflammation. You get a mismatch. So you have irrational thoughts. Your frontal cortex is screaming at you to say, look, don't worry, but the amygdala keeps on telling you that there's fear everywhere. And that's what happens in PTSD, that's what happens in chronic anxiety. And that's what happens if you're obese and you've got inactivity because of the inflammation. You also get the mitochondria, I will mention it, where you get free radicals coming out, and that can cut off the end of the telomeres of the chromosomes. What are they? Well, they help us live longer. The longer the telomere, the longer you'll live. And if you've got those free radicals from inactivity, that will cause more inflammation. And that inflammation goes to the brain and causes degeneration. And that not only of the amygdala side, it causes depression and anxiety. The hippocampus is a very important part of the brain for depression. Literally, physical activity increases the size of it, so there's less depression. When you become inactive, it reduces by about 20%. So that's another simple way of going on. The stress response, the body is constantly with this chronic inflammation, chronic stress causing cortisol, which actually destroys parts of the brain. It's destructive, not neuroregenerative. So you start to get problems with the brain there. And finally, the blood flow, endorphins, BDNF, all of these things come out to cause and to help the brain as well. So there's loads of different parts where activity can help the brain become less depressed, anxious, and other issues. Now, we've got an epidemic in mental health. It's been going up since the pandemic. You can see here that referrals to CAMHS, which is the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, has been going steadily up, and that's an underestimate because a lot of the CAMHS people have said that they've raised the threshold for the referrals. So as a GP, you're having to deal with a lot more than we've ever had to deal with. 29% of adults say they're mentally worse off than before the pandemic. 81% of them with a pre-existing condition are worse off. And as GPs, we're now from 25% of all consultations that had mental health, that's gone up to about 38%. In fact, it's the biggest cause of the rise of general practice consultations. And if we look at some of those people there, you can see that we have about 1 million consultations a day. So you can see what that rise is in numbers, just vast, vast numbers. And now 70% of GPs saying we're now out of our depth. It's taking so long to get the referrals that we're now dealing with things that we haven't got the full training. You know, including some of those of children who have suicidal tendencies, which in teenagers is increasingly common. They've got that feeling. Now having to wait 38 days on average, to go to CAMHS. So the GPs are having to cope with that. So you can see that this is an unsustainable and real problem that's taking place here. If we look at, as Jamie said, the inequalities there, you can see here by the socioeconomic groups that you've got here, that those in the lower social classes are feeling more lonely than those in the higher economic groups. So you're finding that there is increasing stretch and inequalities in the mental health. And age-wise, this is even more worrying, that those children, well, young adults really here, 16 to 34-year-olds, you can see that their anxiety levels have gone up since the pandemic started, pre to post, whereas in the elderly, it's actually stayed stable, or even the very elderly, it's gone down. So the mental health epidemic is very much the young person's problem at the moment, and it's continuing to go up. So how do we look at the evidence? Well, pretty much, as Jamie said, you've got some strong evidence that physical activity can help with Depression particularly, anxiety, cognitive development and dementia. Happiness as well. Loneliness is mixed. It depends what the physical activity is. If you're on your own doing physical activity, you're not going to really improve the loneliness. For children, the evidence is slightly weaker, simply because the trials are still being done. But there's enough there to say it's incredibly important. But again, the context of the physical activity, as we heard from Matt's story of Joan, is important in children as well. So what types of activity work for mental health? Well, aerobic is where most of the evidence is, the 150 minutes of moderate physical activity. That's where a lot of that work has gone. Muscle strengthening, surprisingly, is as good as aerobic. So don't ever think that you've got aerobic. And that's why the new guidance of the government, the CMO report, put muscle strengthening right in the middle to try and elevate its status, because it is so important. So it's as good as aerobic. Sedentary is a bit more complicated, because if you're very depressed, you're going to become sedentary. So it's disentangling the kind of cause and effect. But there is evidence to show that some of the sedentary behaviour is causing the depression, because you're becoming more isolated. High intensity. Everyone gets excited about high intensity. Well, mixed for mental health. Brilliant for physical, for diabetes. But for mental health, it can help depression, but in some studies it's actually increased anxiety and perceived stress. And actually the biggest problem is it undermines competence, which a study from Nanette Moutry and Steve Biddle saying actually it could probably stop people from becoming active because they feel it's more unpleasant and they lose their competence. So we have to be a bit careful on the physical activity of high intensity and mental health. So this is the important part then, the domains. So a 1950s picture here. We always say that physical activity has gone down because we're not doing housework. But this study in a deprived area showed that women who increased their household chores with activity became more depressed. Now that may not be surprising when you can think about it. But we might say, well, it's part of the 150 minutes. If you blink and think, oh, that's part of the 150 minutes, well, off you go, do it. But who wants to do that? And this starts to kind of question, should we be thinking differently about the physical activity and mental health compared to the physical health, where any physical activity is good? Again, there's a very good link about active transport improving mental health, except for women in deprived communities where it's the opposite. It makes them more stressed and more depressed. So this starts to kind of question, what are we doing by being very kind of, single-minded in our 150 minutes is good for mental health? Well, it's not always. The context of that activity is much more important when we talk about mental health. Promoting physical activity, leisure-based, is where the mental health is really good. By the way, occupational, I didn't put it in there, is also mixed and often negative. So, but when we talk about it in leisure time, that's where you start to get the real benefits. And when you add social to that, you get even more benefits. And then when you add nature to that, you get even more benefits. So the green exercise and blue exercise, which is water-based, has got even additional factors on mental health. So let's just have a look at that, because that's an area which we're quite interested in here. Compared to indoors, exercising in natural environments does have additional benefits: revitalization, energy, confusion, it all goes, anger, depression, disappear much more than when you're indoors, particularly for younger people. There are lots of theories about how it works, but basically the brain changes. It feels safe in a natural environment, and that safety is one of those bigger factors that we were talking about. Even your telomeres get longer when you're doing physical activity outdoors compared to when you're doing it indoors. And children outdoors, again, they've measured those telomeres again, and it increases those telomeres. So there's definitely an additional benefit that we need to work on. And if we look at here, we can see the happiness associated with different parts of green on blue, being by the coast is by far the most beneficial for happiness for a lot of people there, but certainly the mountains and other areas improve as well. So finally, just putting it into action. So we've been trying to work with Beat Street to get people outdoors who don't normally go outdoors. That's the main thing. But physical activity fits in with that nature connection and with that social connection. And here's Leicester Beat Street, where we were trying to get people out into the whole of Leicester, and we looked at their nature connectiveness before and after. And what we saw was that those who are very inactive increased significantly more than those who are active. So we got those who are inactive outdoors into nature. Canal and River Trust are our partners, and we've got more people. 38% said they're now using a towpath a lot more. And anxiety levels we've been measuring. So we can get these, and you can see about 2,300 people there. We've got matched pairs. So just a conclusion. It's a very simple conclusion. It's not talking about physical activity. We're talking about physical activity, social activity, and emotional activity. And I thank Muir Gray for putting it so neatly like that. And I'm going to add one more, which is environmental activity. So when we're looking at mental health, it's a combination of all of those things, not just the physical activity can help. Thanks very much, Yvonne.